As I helped an elderly woman pick up her fallen belongings at my daughter's gallery opening, she suddenly gripped my wrist and whispered, "If your daughter gives you a painting, do not hang it up."
Heat the back of the wooden frame. At the time, I almost laughed it off, but exactly a week later, my daughter smiled as she handed me a carefully wrapped painting.
That smile made me shiver, recalling the warning. At night, as the whole house fell silent, I tremblingly held a candle to the back of the frame, and what happened next left me paralyzed. Welcome to our story. Before we go deeper, please like, subscribe, and tell us where are you watching from. Note that this account features dramatized elements for an enhanced narrative experience. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is coincidental. However, the emotional message at its heart is universal. When I knelt to help an elderly woman gather her scattered belongings at my daughter's gallery opening, she gripped my hand and whispered, "When your daughter gives you a painting, do not hang it. Hold a lit candle to the back of the frame." At the time, I nearly laughed. 2 weeks later, at 2 in the morning, I held a birthday candle to the back of the painting my daughter had made for me, and what came out of the wood was not paint. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the evening it started. The gallery was on Broad Street in Charleston, a narrow storefront with exposed brick walls and track lighting that made every canvas glow as if lit from within. October had turned the air cool enough for jackets, and the street outside held that particular Friday evening energy of a city settling into its weekend. I stood near the back wall with a glass of white wine I had barely touched, watching the room fill. My name is Frank Holbrook. I am 68 years old. I spent 40 years as a bridge engineer, inspecting the steel bones of South Carolina's oldest crossings. And when I retired 3 years ago, I thought the most dangerous thing left in my life was the creak in my garden gate. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a number of things. The paintings on the walls belonged to my daughter, Grace Holbrook Pennington, 36. The artist, whose name was printed on the exhibition card beside the gallery door, moved through the opening night crowd in a dark green dress with her auburn hair pinned loosely, accepting compliments with the same focused, slightly tilted smile she had worn since she was a child, presenting a drawing for approval. I watched her the way I always watched her, with a pride so deep it lived somewhere beneath language. Her landscapes were luminous. Her technique had sharpened in the past 2 years. Helen would have been proud. Helen was my wife. Helen was dead. That space beside me, where she used to stand at events like this, was the loudest silence in the room. I want you to understand something about that evening. I was not a man who believed in premonitions. I had spent 40 years measuring steel and concrete materials that either held or they did not. There was no mystery in a bridge. A load was calculable. A failure was traceable. I trusted numbers the way some men trust prayer, and I had never in my life encountered a problem that could not be solved with patience and a sharp pencil. And yet, near the gallery entrance, my son-in-law stood with his hands in his pockets. Curtis Pennington, 38, a logistics coordinator, who married my daughter 6 years ago in my garden under the live oak where Helen's parents had exchanged their own vows. Curtis wore a charcoal blazer with no tie, and I noticed the way you notice things without knowing yet why they matter, that he was not looking at the paintings. His eyes moved wall to wall, slowly cataloging the dimensions of the space, rather than appreciating what hung on them. I filed this observation in the place where I kept things I did not yet understand. The woman was sitting alone near the back corner. She was small and fine-boned, mid-70s at least, wearing a long gray wool coat and a dark green beret that sat precisely on her silver hair. Her handbag had slipped from the chair beside her and spilled its contents across the polished concrete floor, a ring of keys, a folded handkerchief, reading glasses in a hard case. Every other person in that gallery stepped around her. A dozen people, maybe more, and not one of them stopped. I did. That single decision, the decision to kneel beside a stranger and gather her scattered belongings, is the reason I am alive to tell you this. I collected the items and placed them back in her bag. She looked up at me, and her eyes were not the watery, unfocused eyes I expected from a woman her age. They were clear and sharp, and reading something in my face that I did not know was written there. She smelled of lavender and peppermint, and the scent was so specific, so deliberate, that it felt less like perfume and more like a signature. She took the bag with one hand. With the other, she gripped my wrist. Her fingers were bony and surprisingly strong, and the chill of her skin went through me like a current. "Listen to me carefully," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried, as if she had rehearsed this moment and would not be rushed through it. "When your daughter gives you a painting, do not hang it. Hold a lit candle to the back of the frame. Do you understand me?" I tried to pull my hand back gently. "Ma'am, I think you might have me confused with someone else." Her grip tightened. "I am not confusing you, Frank. A candle. The back of the frame. Promise me." My name in her mouth stopped everything. The gallery noise dimmed. The wine glass in my other hand felt suddenly heavy. I looked at this woman I had never met, and she looked back at me with an expression that was not pleading, but certain, absolutely certain, the way a doctor is certain. The way a structural report is certain when it tells you a bridge has 6 months left. "I promise," I said, because I did not know what else to say. She released my wrist. She nodded once. And then someone touched my shoulder, a gallery attendant, asking if I wanted a refill, and I turned away for no more than 3 seconds. How does a stranger in a crowded gallery know your name? How does she know you have a daughter who paints? I had never seen this woman before in my life. I was certain of it then. I am no longer certain of anything about that evening. When I turned back, the chair was empty. The space beside the back wall held nothing but cooling air and the faintest trace of lavender and peppermint. She was gone. Every direction I looked, the crowd moved in its usual slow rotation wine glasses and murmured praise, and the woman in the green beret was nowhere among them. She had vanished the way a scent vanishes completely and without permission, leaving only the warning lodged in my mind like a splinter I could not yet reach. An hour later, my headlights swept across the iron gate, and it gave the same creak it had been giving since Helen's grandfather hung it in 1962. Some sounds you stop hearing. This was not one of them. I pulled into the gravel drive, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the tick of the cooling motor and the low rush of the tide beyond the dunes. The gallery was 23 miles behind me. The woman in the green beret was already becoming something I could file away and explain later. A confused stranger. A coincidence. The mind is very good at building shelves for things it does not want to examine. I got out of the car and walked to the front porch. The boards gave under my weight the way they always had, each one flexing in its own particular pattern, a language I had learned without trying over the course of 40 years. Helen Holbrook, my wife of 39 years, had been dead for 2 years by the night of the gallery opening, but her lavender was still growing in the garden bed by the back porch, and the house still smelled faintly of the beeswax she used on the wide plank floors every spring. I had continued the tradition, not because the floors needed it, but because my hands needed something to do on Saturday mornings that was not sitting in a kitchen built for 2 and eating breakfast for 1. I still sometimes turned to say something to her before I remembered there was no one there to hear it. Grief does that. It does not take your memory. It leaves your memory perfectly intact and then punishes you for having it. I would hear a song on the radio and begin to hum the harmony she used to carry, and the silence where her voice should have joined mine was louder than anything the radio could produce. The house was full of those silences. They lived in the hallway, and the kitchen, and the bedroom, and the garden. They were the most permanent residents of that house, more permanent than me, and they would outlast me when I was gone. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, the way an empty house holds its breath when it has been waiting for you. Salt air came through the screens, carrying the faint ghost of rosemary and thyme from Helen's herb garden by the kitchen window. I did not turn on many lights. One in the hallway, one in the kitchen, enough to move through without bumping into the furniture that Helen had arranged. and I had never rearranged, because the arrangement was hers, and moving it would have been a kind of erasure I was not ready for. 3 generations had lived inside those walls. Helen's grandparents built the house in 1958 with timber they selected themselves from a mill outside Somerville. Her parents raised her here. We raised Grace here. Every board in that porch had been walked on by someone I loved, and most of them were gone now. The house remembered all of them. I could feel it in the way the floors settled at night, in the way the wind moved through the eaves with a sound that was less like weather and more like breathing. I was the last one the house needed to remember. After me it would either stand or be torn down, and I did not like to think about which was more likely. I walked through the living room and stopped. On the far wall above the sideboard Helen had inherited from her mother hung a painting Grace had given me the previous year, a marsh scene at dawn, Sullivan's Island light rendered in the soft greens and golds that Grace handled so well. I had been grateful for it. I had told her it was beautiful, and I meant it. Curtis had framed it. He had insisted, in fact, said he knew a place that did excellent work, and the frame had arrived heavy and dark solid walnut with a hand-rubbed finish that complemented the canvas. I had not questioned it. Why would I? My son-in-law had framed a painting for me. It was a generous thing to do. But that evening, for the first time, and I do not know why that evening and not any of the hundreds of evenings before it, I stopped in front of that painting and lifted the bottom edge slightly from the wall. The frame was heavier than it should have been. Not by much, not enough to alarm anyone who was not in the habit of weighing things. But I had spent 40 years lifting steel beams and concrete samples and bridge components, whose weight I could estimate within a half-pound by feel alone, and this frame was wrong. It carried more weight than walnut and canvas and backing board could account for. A few ounces, maybe more. Enough for my hands to register the difference without my mind, yet knowing what to do with the information. I set it back against the wall. I stood there looking at my daughter's painting, at the marsh light she had captured so precisely, at the heavy frame my son-in-law had chosen and delivered and hung on my wall with his own hands. I thought about the old woman at the gallery. Not clearly. The memory came back the way a sound comes through water muffled and shapeless, just the pressure of it. Something about a candle, something about the back of a frame. I shook my head. I turned off the hall light, then the kitchen light, and the house settled into darkness around me. Outside, the wind shifted and moved through Helen's garden, carrying rosemary and salt, and the faintest trace of lavender. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom and lay down in the dark, and the house creaked around me the way it always did, its old bones adjusting. And somewhere beneath my conscious thought, the weight of that frame sat like a stone, dropped into deep water, sinking slowly toward something I was not yet ready to find. I slept poorly and woke to a house that was already full of light. Saturday mornings on Sullivan's Island have a particular quality in October. The sun lower and more golden than summer, and it comes through the east-facing windows with a warmth that feels borrowed, as if it knows the cold is not far behind. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter waiting for it to cool. The stone that had settled in my mind the night before was still there somewhere deep, but the morning had covered it with ordinary things the way sand covers a shell at high tide. You can still feel it underfoot. You just cannot see it. The coffee was still too hot to drink when my phone rang. Grace's name on the screen. I picked up before the second ring, a reflex from the years when every call from my daughter might have been good news or a catastrophe, and I had never learned to wait long enough to find out which. Dad, the coastal piece from the front wall it sold last night? Full asking price. Her voice was bright and quick the way it got when she was excited, and I felt the old warmth rise in my chest, the pride that never diminished, no matter how many paintings she sold or how many years passed since I had watched her mix her first colors at the kitchen table with Helen guiding her hand. I told her I was proud of her. I meant it completely. She talked for a few minutes about the buyer, a couple from Savannah, and about 2 other pieces that had drawn interest, and I listened the way I always listened to Grace, with my full attention and a quiet gratitude that my daughter had found something she was good at and something that was good to her. Then she mentioned Curtis, and something in her tone shifted. Not dramatically. If you were not listening for it, you would not have caught it. But I had spent 40 years listening to the sound structures make before they fail, and I knew what a micro shift sounded like. Curtis sends his love. He has been talking about coming down for Thanksgiving again. I had not thought about those 3 moments together before. That is important. Separately, each one had an explanation. Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Curtis walking through the house with his hands behind his back, pausing at every window, every door frame, not admiring, but measuring. The way I had seen contractors survey a property before making an offer. I had chalked it up to curiosity. He was a logistics man. He thought in systems and dimensions. It was how his mind worked. Then Christmas the same year. A casual comment over turkey about Sullivan's Island property values how the market was moving, how the waterfront market had shifted in ways that made our stretch of coastline sound less like a neighborhood and more like an asset portfolio. He said it the way you mentioned the weather. Helen was still alive then sitting at the head of the table, and she went quiet when Curtis spoke. I noticed. I attributed it to the cancer, the fatigue that came in waves by then. And 6 months ago, a phone call from Curtis, solicitous and warm, suggesting I think about simplifying the estate. Not selling, he said quickly, just getting the paperwork in order, maybe talking to someone about a trust. For Grace's sake, he said, to make things easier down the road. 3 moments. 3 hairline fractures in the same beam. There is a thing that happens in bridge inspection when you find that pattern. Individually, each crack is within tolerance. Together, they tell you the structure is failing from the inside. You cannot unsee it once the pattern assembles itself. I was beginning to see a pattern. I did not yet know what the pattern meant, but the shape of it was there, and once a shape like that enters your field of vision, it does not leave. Grace was still talking. I heard her voice come back into focus the way a radio signal clears after static. I am working on something new, she said. Specifically for you. I will bring it next Friday. A painting. Made for me. Coming Friday. I thanked her. I told her I could not wait to see it. The conversation ended warmly, the way our conversations always ended, with love and see you soon, and the particular click of a call between a father and daughter who had never once raised their voices at each other. I set the phone on the counter and picked up my coffee. It had cooled enough to drink, but I did not drink it yet. A new painting for me. Friday. I carried the thought outside. The back door opened onto a low porch that Helen had lined with terracotta pots, most of them empty now. And beyond it, the garden beds stretched toward the property line where the salt marsh began. Helen's lavender was still blooming. October in the low country is kind to lavender. The heat eases but does not vanish, and the plants hold on longer than they should. Their gray-green stems still carrying clusters of pale purple that released their scent when the breeze moved through them. I stood in the garden bed she had planted the spring before the diagnosis and breathed in. Lavender. The smell filled my nose and my chest, and for no reason I could identify I thought of the gallery, not the paintings, not Grace, not Curtis. The woman. The old woman in the green beret with her scattered belongings and her bony grip and her voice saying my name as if she had known it for years. I stood there for a while, not thinking clearly about anything, just standing in the smell of something my wife had planted and something a stranger had carried. And the 2 scents overlapped in my mind without connecting 2 transparencies laid over each other that did not yet form a single image. I stepped back inside. I closed the door. I poured my coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen counter looking out at Helen's garden. A new painting made specifically for me arriving next Friday. I did not know yet what was coming, but something in me, something older than logic, something that lived in the same place as the creak of that iron gate had already begun to prepare. But before I tell you what happened next, I need to tell you about Helen, because nothing that follows will make sense without her, and everything that was taken from me began with what she left behind. Helen Holbrook, my wife of 39 years, had been dead for 2 years by the night of the gallery opening. I say that plainly because she would have wanted it said plainly. No poetry, no trembling lip, just the fact of it laid down like a surveyor's stake. Helen was a conservator at the Gibbes Museum of Art in Charleston, a woman who could identify a forgery by the smell of the varnish, and who corrected a young bridge engineer's drawing the first time they ever met. That was 1985. I was 29 inspecting a span near the museum, sketching a truss detail on my clipboard during a break, and a woman in a paint-stained apron walked up behind me and said, "You are drawing the compression member wrong." That was the first thing my wife ever said to me. I married her 11 months later. You need to understand something about Sullivan's Island in 1985. It was not what it is now. There were no hedge fund families building glass boxes on the dunes. There were shrimpers, and there were retired Navy families, and there were people like Helen's grandparents who had simply been there long enough to forget they owned anything valuable. Helen's grandfather built the house in 1958. With timber he selected himself from a mill outside Somerville. He carved the porch rail with a pocket knife. Over the course of one winter, his initials worked into the grain at the south end, where the afternoon light hit longest. Helen's parents raised her in that house. We raised Grace in that house. The screen door had a spring that Helen refused to let me oil because she liked the sound. It made a particular squeal and slap that announced every arrival and departure for 60 years. We had a good life. I want to be clear about that, because what comes later might make you wonder whether there were signs I should have seen cracks in the foundation that a more attentive man would have noticed. There were not. Or if there were, they were so fine and so deep that no inspection could have found them. Helen rose through the Gibbes until she was head of conservation, a position she held for 18 years. I inspected bridges across the low-country steel and concrete spans that carried thousands of people a day over water they never thought about. And I found satisfaction in the invisible work of keeping things standing. We were not wealthy. We were not poor. We were people who lived in a house that had been paid off before we were born, in a place where the salt air and the marsh light were free, and that had always been enough. Grace was our only child. She came late when Helen was 37 and I was 33, and she arrived with Helen's eyes and my hands and a temperament that belonged entirely to herself. She drew before she could write. She painted before she could read. Helen guided her not with lessons, but with proximity, letting Grace sit beside her at the museum workbench and watch conservation techniques the way some children watch cooking. By the time Grace was 16, her teachers were sending work home with notes that said things like extraordinary spatial awareness and advanced color intuition. We were proud. We were always proud. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Pancreatic. Stage 3. Helen asked the oncologist how long, and when he told her, she thanked him the way she thanked the man who bagged her groceries. She did not cry in that office. She cried once at home, standing in the garden with her hands in the dirt, and I held her from behind, and we did not speak. Because there was nothing language could do that silence could not do better. She lived 14 months past the diagnosis. She worked at the Gibbes until 6 weeks before the end. She died in the bedroom where her parents had slept, and where we had slept for 38 years. And the last thing she looked at was the window that faced the marsh. And the last thing she said to me was, "The light is good this morning." I stayed. Of course I stayed. Where would I go? The house was not a building to me. It was a record of every person I had loved written in floorboards and garden beds and the creak of an iron gate. I waxed the floors the way Helen had waxed them. I watered her garden. I cooked for one and ate standing at the counter because sitting at the table built for 4 felt like sitting in a theater after the play had ended and the actors had gone home. Helen's colleague at the Gibbas, a woman named Margaret Redmond, who had worked beside her for 22 years, told me once that Helen kept a photograph of Sullivan's Island on her desk, long before she kept one of Grace. I did not know what to do with that information at the time. I filed it the way I filed most things that did not yet have a place in my understanding. And near the end, in the final weeks, something shifted. Helen went quiet in a way that was different from the fatigue. It was selective. She spoke freely about the museum, about the garden, about me. But when Curtis's name came up, she stopped. Not dramatically. She simply went still the way the air goes still before a pressure change. I noticed. I attributed it to the morphine, to the exhaustion, to the 1,000 small surrenders a dying body forces on a living mind. I did not press. I wish I had. How do you put a price on a porch rail your wife's grandfather carved with a pocket knife in 1947? You do not. But someone will. Neighboring lots on Sullivan's Island were already selling for $1.5, sometimes $2 million. Developers were circling. The house I lived in was worth more dead than alive as property. I had no intention of selling. It had never occurred to me that anyone in my family would. That was the first of many things I was wrong about. Grace married Curtis Pennington 6 years ago in the garden under the live oak where Helen's parents had married 40 years before that. I gave her away in a linen suit that still smelled like Helen's closet, mothballs and cedar, and the faintest trace of the perfume she had not worn in months. And when Curtis took my daughter's hand at the altar, I felt something shift in the geometry of my family that I would not understand for years. It was not an unpleasant feeling. It was more like the moment a bridge settles onto new bearings after a retrofit. Everything holds. Everything looks fine. But the load paths have changed, and if you are not paying attention, you will not notice until the stress finds the weak point. Helen approved of Curtis. She said so the night before the wedding, standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a calmness that I took for contentment. He will be good for her, she said. I believed her because I had never known Helen to be wrong about people. She had spent her career studying the surfaces of things, paint layers and varnish coats, and the invisible architecture beneath, and she read people the same way she read canvases, with an eye for what was underneath. If Helen said Curtis was good for Grace, then Curtis was good for Grace. I did not question it then. I question everything now. Let me be clear about something. I am not a man who looks for betrayal. The work I did for 40 years was about holding things together, not pulling them apart. You build trust into a structure the same way you build it into a family, carefully, over time, with the understanding that everything depends on it. That was my mistake. Not the trust itself. The failure to inspect what I had already built. I trusted my daughter the way I trusted load-bearing math. I trusted my son-in-law because my wife told me to, and because he was polite, and because he carved the turkey at Thanksgiving and cleared the dishes without being asked, and called me Dad in a voice that sounded like it meant something. That was my mistake, not the trust itself, the failure to verify. Curtis Pennington was a logistics coordinator who traveled to Atlanta 3 weeks out of every month, managing supply chains for a company whose name I could never remember because he changed jobs every 2 years. He was 32 when he married Grace, and competent in the way that certain men are competent. Good with systems, good with schedules, good with the kind of organizational thinking that makes other people feel taken care of. Grace's art career was emerging. Her first gallery show came 2 years after the wedding, and Curtis handled the framing, the shipping, the insurance, all the infrastructure that allowed Grace to focus on the work itself. He was useful. I can see now that being useful was part of the design. The property comments started small. Thanksgiving, the year Helen died. Curtis carving the turkey, the knife moving through the breast in clean, even slices, and between slices he said, "You know what? The lot 3 doors down went for 1.6. Just the lot. No house." He said it the way you mention a score from a game you did not watch casually, with no apparent stake in the answer. I said something about the market being what it was. Helen was at the table. She went quiet. I noticed. I did not ask why. Curtis never said the word sell, not once. He did not have to. He spoke in numbers the way some men speak in threats, casually at dinner, always with a smile, always while doing something generous like pouring my wine or clearing my plate. Christmas that year, another number. Easter, a reference to estate planning. A phone call 6 months ago suggesting I simplify things, get the paperwork in order, talk to someone about a trust. For Grace's sake, he said. To make things easier down the road. Each comment was reasonable in isolation. Each one was wrapped in warmth and good manners, and the particular deference a son-in-law shows a father-in-law he wants something from. And Grace, my daughter. She never once mentioned the house or the property or the money. She did not need to. That was the division of labor I would only understand later. Curtis delivered the numbers. Grace delivered the love. And between them, like two walls leaning against each other to form an arch, they created a pressure I could feel but could not see. Daddy, I would never ask you to sell. Grace said it once unprompted during a Sunday phone call about nothing in particular, and it was the unprompted part that stayed with me. I had not mentioned selling. No one had mentioned selling in that conversation. But there it was, the denial arriving before the accusation, the reassurance offered for a fear I had not expressed. It was like finding a crack repair on a beam that no one had reported as damaged. Either someone saw the crack and fixed it quietly, or someone put the patch there to make you think the beam was sound when it was not. There is a kind of love that functions like scaffolding. It holds you up. It surrounds you completely. It is warm and it is visible, and it makes you feel supported in a way that seems permanent. And then one day, the building is finished, and you realize the scaffolding was never part of the structure. It was only there to make construction possible. When the building is done, scaffolding comes down. I loved my daughter. I had always loved my daughter, but there was something in the architecture of her warmth, a precision to it, as if she were always building something with her affection, rather than simply feeling it. Each phone call arrived at the right interval. Each visit carried the right gift. Each expression of concern for my health, my loneliness, my future was calibrated with a care that I wanted to call love, and sometimes could not. I had never said this aloud. I had barely allowed myself to think it, but Helen had thought it. I know that now. Because 3 weeks before she died, Helen made a phone call I was never meant to hear. But that phone call belongs to a later part of this story. What I need to tell you now is what happened the following Friday, because that is the evening everything changed, from a shape I could not name into something I could hold in my hands. She arrived just before 5, her car pulling into the gravel drive as the last afternoon light went flat over the water. She carried the painting in both arms wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon, and I remember thinking it looked like something you would carry to a funeral. Not a gift, but an offering. Grace came through the front door, the way she always did, calling out before she was fully inside the screen door, slapping behind her, and the house felt less empty for the first time in a week. Curtis was in Atlanta. I asked after him out of habit. He sends his best, she said, which was not an answer, but I did not press. We cooked dinner together. Shrimp and rice, nothing elaborate, the kind of meal that does not require conversation to fill the silence around it. Grace opened a bottle of white wine and poured 2 glasses, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about the gallery, about the Savannah buyers, about a commission she was considering. I want to tell you the dinner was strange. I want to tell you I noticed something, some tremor in her voice or shadow in her expression that should have warned me. But I did not. We ate shrimp and rice and talked about nothing consequential, and it was the most ordinary evening I had spent in months. That is the thing about a trap. It does not feel like danger. It feels like relief. It feels like your daughter coming home. After dinner, she said she wanted to show me the painting. We cleared the dishes, and she brought it to the living room and set it on the sideboard, still wrapped the red ribbon catching the lamplight. She untied it slowly with a kind of ceremony that I found touching at the time, and peeled the brown paper back, and I saw what she had made for me. She had painted my view. Not the house, not the garden, not the live oak or the gate. My view. The marsh at dawn from my bedroom window, the exact angle I saw every morning when I opened my eyes, the particular slant of early light across the cordgrass. The water beyond it, silver and still. No one had ever seen that view from that angle except me. And Helen. Helen had slept on the other side of that bed for 38 years and had seen the same light and the same water every morning of her life in that house. Grace had painted it from my side. I painted what you see first thing every morning, she said. And her voice had that careful softness she used when she wanted me to feel something specific. I want you to have it in the room where you wake up. So the first thing you see is the same view, but through my eyes. I was moved. I will not pretend otherwise. My daughter had painted the view from my bedroom window and given it to me wrapped in brown paper with a red ribbon. And my eyes stung and my throat closed, and I reached for her and pulled her into a hug that I meant with every part of myself. I held her. I meant it. And over her shoulder in the hallway mirror, I caught her face. It was not the face of someone giving. The expression was not softness or satisfaction or the particular pleasure of watching a gift land well. It was something else. Something patient. Something that was waiting for a result. I saw it for less than a second before she shifted, and the angle changed, and the expression was gone, replaced by the warm smile I had known since she was a child. But I had seen it. The way you see a crack in a beam for one instant, before the shadow shifts and hides it again. You cannot unsee it. You can only decide what to do with what you saw. I decided to do nothing. I let her go. I told her it was beautiful. I told her I would find the perfect wall for it. She smiled and kissed my cheek and said she should get back before it got too late. And by 9 o'clock, her taillights were disappearing down the gravel road, and the house was quiet again. And I was standing in the living room with a painting that my daughter had made for me, and a feeling I could not name sitting in the center of my chest like a stone. I carried the painting upstairs. It was heavier than I expected. The frame was dark and solid, the same style as the frame on the painting she had given me the previous year, the one Curtis had insisted on handling. Same framer I had asked her, touching the edge. Curtis handles all of that, she said, and changed the subject. The frame was dense and well-made and heavier than walnut and canvas should account for. I set it against the bedroom wall below the window that faced the marsh, the window whose view she had painted. I stood there for a moment. Then I reached out to turn the painting over. My hand moved toward the frame, the way it would move toward a junction box on a bridge. The instinct of a man who has spent his life looking at the back of things to understand what the front is hiding. My fingers touched the edge, and then from somewhere beneath the noise of the evening, I heard it again. A candle, the back of the frame. I stopped. I pulled my hand back, because if I turned that painting over and found something I did not want to find, then the evening I had just spent with my daughter, the shrimp and rice and the careful softness in her voice and the painting of my morning view would become something else entirely. And I was not ready for that. Not yet. I went to bed. The painting leaned against the wall 6 feet from where I lay, and I did not sleep well. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I thought I smelled something. Faint, metallic, like a penny left in the rain. I had not gone back to sleep. The metallic smell was still there unchanged, like something that had decided to stay. Not stronger, not weaker, just present the way a sound becomes part of a room if it holds long enough. The painting was leaning against the wall 6 feet from where I lay, and I knew the way you know a bridge is unsound before the math confirms it, that I had to turn it over tonight. I lay in the dark and argued with myself. She is your daughter. She painted your view. She tied it with a red ribbon and carried it in both arms, and her voice cracked when she told you what it was. Go back to sleep. This is grief. This is loneliness. This is a 68-year-old man letting a stranger's whisper in a gallery do what grief could not, which is make him doubt the only person he has left. But then I thought about Helen. Not the Helen who died, but the Helen who went quiet at the table when Curtis's name came up. The Helen who made a phone call 3 weeks before she died that I was never meant to hear. Helen had seen something. Helen, who spent her life looking beneath the surface of things, had looked at our family and gone silent. And I had attributed that silence to morphine when it might have been the clearest thing she ever tried to tell me. I have inspected bridges that were 90 years old and still carrying loads they were never designed for. You learn to listen to steel. It tells you when it is tired. It groans in frequencies most people cannot hear. But if you have spent your life pressed against the metal with your hand flat on the flange, you feel it. You feel it the way you feel weather changing. My house was groaning. I had been ignoring it for months. I was not going to ignore it tonight. I got out of bed. I did not turn on the light. I walked downstairs in the dark, my bare feet knowing every step, every board, every creak. In the kitchen, I stopped at the back door where Helen's gardening gloves still hung on the same hook she had hung them on the last time she wore them 2 years and 4 months ago. Cracked leather, dried soil still in the seams, the shape of her hands still pressed into the fingers. I pulled them on. They were too small. My hands filled them the wrong way, stretching the leather where hers had softened it. I did not ask myself why I was putting on gloves. Some part of me knew. The part that listened to steel, the part that Helen had trained without either of us realizing it. That part was already ahead of my conscious mind, and it said, "Do not touch the frame with your bare hands." So I did not. I found a birthday candle in the emergency drawer. Pink with a white stripe left over from a cake Helen had made for Grace's 28th birthday. I took it upstairs. I went into the bathroom, turned on no lights, and laid the painting face down on the tile floor. The back of the frame was smooth, dark, unremarkable. I struck a match. The sulfur flared, and I smelled it briefly before the birthday candle caught and held its small, steady flame. I brought the candle close to the back of the frame near the bottom edge where the wood met the backing board. I held it there, 1 inch away. The flame did not waver. 30 seconds. Nothing happened. I almost laughed. I almost set the candle down and went back to bed and spent the rest of my life not knowing. I was a foolish old man on a cold bathroom floor holding a pink birthday candle over his daughter's painting at 2 in the morning because a stranger in a green beret had told him to. I almost stopped. Then the varnish moved. It softened first the surface, going from matte to glossy in a small circle around the heat. Then the wood beneath it seemed to shift, and I saw lines appear that had not been there before, thin and precise, machined into the frame with a regularity that was not natural. Channels, cut into the wood and sealed beneath the varnish, invisible, until heat broke the seal. And from those channels, slowly, like something waking from a long sleep, silver metallic beads began to emerge. They were small, smaller than peppercorns, and they caught the candlelight as they rolled free of the channels and moved across the white tile with a weight that was wrong for their size. They moved the way liquid moves, but they were solid, or nearly solid, and they kept coming one after another, separating from the wood as the heat softened the varnish seal that had held them in place. I set the candle down on the tile. I stepped back. I removed Helen's gloves, carefully turning them inside out, the way you handle contaminated material, the way I had been trained to handle anything on a job site that you did not yet understand. I set the gloves on the floor. I went to the sink and washed my hands. I washed them again. The water was cold, and I let it run over my fingers, and I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. And the man looking back at me was someone I did not fully recognize. I did not call the police. I did not take a photograph. My phone was in the bedroom, and I did not go to get it. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub in the dark, with the painting face down on the floor and the silver beads scattered on the tile around it, catching the moonlight through the bathroom window. I said my daughter's name once quietly to no one. Grace. Just the word. It did not echo. It sat in the room the way the beads sat on the tile, heavy and still and impossible to unsee. My daughter painted that. My daughter gave me that. She wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a red ribbon and told me she had painted my morning view through her eyes. And inside the frame, hidden beneath varnish and sealed in machine channels, was something that was never meant to be found. The candle burned down on the tile beside the painting. The flame shrank and flickered and went out. In the dark, I could still see the beads. Moonlight found them the way moonlight finds water, drawn to anything that reflects. They looked like they had always been there waiting. I sat on the edge of my bathtub until the sky outside the window began to change. When the sun came up, I would need to decide what kind of man I was. I was still sitting on the bathroom floor at 6:47 in the morning when my phone rang from the bedroom. The sun had come up while I sat there. Light crept across the tile and found the silver beads, and they caught it the way water catches light, indifferent and precise. And I had watched them for 4 hours without moving. Now the phone was ringing, and I knew it was Grace before I stood up. A daughter who gives you a gift calls the next morning to ask if you have used it yet. I walked to the bedroom. I picked up the phone. I answered it. "Did you hang it yet?" Her voice was morning bright, the voice of a woman who had slept well. I could hear coffee in the background, a spoon against ceramic. The small domestic sounds of a person beginning an ordinary Saturday. "I am still deciding on the wall," I said. It was the first lie I ever told my daughter. 68 years of fatherhood. And I had never once lied to Grace, not about Santa Claus, not about her mother's prognosis, not about anything. And now I stood in the bedroom where the painting was supposed to hang, and I lied to her with a steadiness that surprised me. The bedroom, Daddy. That is where the morning light is best. I want you to understand what it costs to lie to your child for the first time at 68. Every previous conversation, every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every phone call that began with "Hi, Daddy" becomes evidence in a case you did not know you were building. You realize that honesty was not just a principle, it was a currency. And you have just spent the last of it. Curtis had said the same thing about the last painting. The bedroom, the morning light. Word for word. Two people, the same instruction, delivered months apart, in voices that sounded spontaneous and were not. I heard the script underneath the warmth the way you hear rebar underneath plaster when you tap a wall. The structure was there. It had always been there. I had simply never tapped hard enough to find it. The call ended warmly. "Love you, Daddy. Love you too." I set the phone on the kitchen counter and made coffee on autopilot, the motions so practiced that my hands did them while my mind was somewhere else entirely. Then I scrolled through my contacts to a name I had not called in 2 years. Margaret Redmond had been Helen's colleague at the Gibbs Museum for 22 years, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and forgot no one's secrets. She was in her 60s now, retired the year after Helen died, and I had spoken to her exactly once since the funeral, a brief and painful call in which neither of us said anything adequate. I called her now because she was the only person I knew who might connect the woman at the gallery to Helen's world. "Frank," she said when she picked up. Her voice carried the careful warmth of someone who has been waiting for a call she hoped would never come. I described the woman from the gallery. Small, mid-70s, green beret, silver hair, clear eyes, lavender and peppermint, Dorothy Callahan. That was her name. My wife's closest friend for 30 years, and I had never heard it. Helen had hidden her the way you hide a fire extinguisher behind glass in case of emergency brake, only when everything else has failed. Margaret told me carefully the way you deliver a structural report when the findings are bad. Dorothy Callahan was a retired art conservator. She said one of the best in the Southeast. A woman who had trained at the Art Institute in Chicago alongside Helen before either of them came to Charleston. They had been close since their 20s. Helen never introduced you because Dorothy asked her not to. She said if anything ever went wrong, she needed to be someone no one in your family recognized. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The coffee I had poured was going cold beside my hand. Margaret continued. Dorothy had been monitoring the King Street art supply shops, the way she monitored auction catalogs, out of professional habit and a promise she had made. She found a custom varnish order, Margaret said, a formulation no legitimate conservator would use. She recognized what it was designed to do. She traced the specification form back to Curtis's name. He had placed the custom frame order, as he always handled that side of things. But Dorothy told me the name on the pickup receipt was different, and she had made a promise to Helen, a deathbed promise that if anything ever threatened you, she would intervene. I stood in my kitchen and listened to my dead wife's contingency plan unfold from a woman I had not spoken to in 2 years. Helen had seen this coming. Not the specific painting, not the specific method, but the shape of the threat. She had looked at our family the way she looked at a canvas under restoration, reading the layers beneath the surface. And she had seen something in the deepest layer that frightened her enough to build a failsafe. Margaret, I said. My voice was steady, but I could feel the steadiness costing me something. The woman at the gallery. Dorothy. Helen sent her to warn me. A pause. Then Margaret said Dorothy went on her own. She had been watching. She saw the order at King Street, and she knew what it meant, and she went to the gallery because she had promised Helen. But Frank, there is something else. There is a silence that happens when someone is about to tell you your daughter is trying to kill you. It is not shock, and it is not disbelief. It is the sound of every memory you have rearranging itself to accommodate a truth that was always there, shifting like furniture in a room where the floor has suddenly tilted. Dorothy said Helen told her Margaret said, and her voice was quiet now, almost a whisper. The person she worried about most was not your son-in-law. A pause on the line. It was Grace. I did not say anything. I thanked Margaret and hung up. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and sat very still. The coffee was cold. The morning light came through the window above the sink and fell across the counter where Helen used to leave notes for me. Little folded pieces of paper with grocery lists or reminders, or sometimes just the words "I love you" in her careful, tilted handwriting. Helen had known. Helen had prepared. And somewhere in this house, in a letter or a document or a hiding place that only a wife of 39 years would think to use, Helen had left me something else. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. Then I went upstairs. Not to the bathroom where the painting was still face down on the tile, but further down the hall past the linen closet that still smelled like Helen's detergent, to the room at the end. Grace's old studio. The door stuck the way it always had, swollen from decades of salt air, and I had to lean into it with my shoulder. Inside, the morning light came through the east window in a narrow blade that cut across the drafting table. Dust moved through it like something alive. The room had not changed since Grace left for the School of the Arts at 17. The same mason jars of dried brushes, the same curled sketches thumbtacked to the corkboard, the same faint smell of linseed and turpentine that no amount of years could lift from the wood. I stood there and breathed it in. It smelled like my daughter before she became someone I could no longer recognize. I was not looking for anything specific. That is what I told myself. I opened the narrow closet where Helen had stored Grace's early portfolios, the oversized leather cases with brass buckles that we bought her for her 16th birthday. I pulled the first one out and laid it on the drafting table. Inside were charcoal studies from high school, a marsh bird, a live oak. Helen's hands folded in her lap. I turned through them slowly. The paper was still good. The lines were still sure. I felt nothing dangerous until I reached the third portfolio. There, between a watercolor of the dock pilings and a Conte crayon sketch of the front porch, I found a folded piece of paper that did not belong. It was newer than everything around it. White, unaged, creased once down the center. I unfolded it and read, "You think you know when something was planted. You think deception announces itself with a flourish, a change in temperature, a crack in the plaster. It does not. It sits between things you love and it waits." The paper was a printed summary, our property address on Sullivan's Island, a current market valuation, the name of a commercial brokerage in Mount Pleasant, and a projected closing timeline. The date at the top read April 2024, 6 months before the gallery opening. 6 months before my daughter handed me a painting with silver beads hidden in the frame. I read it twice then, a third time, because the mind resists what the hands already know. The valuation was not a surprise. The address was not a surprise. The surprise was the timeline, a sequence of steps laid out in 4 phases, beginning with cognitive decline documentation and ending with a power of attorney petition. My daughter had written my disappearance in 4 clean paragraphs. I photographed the document with my phone, both sides. Then I folded it along its original crease and placed it back exactly where I had found it, between the watercolor and the Conte crayon sketch. And I closed the portfolio and returned it to the closet. My hands did not shake. I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that should be there, but is not a clock that has stopped a bird that has gone silent. My hands were perfectly still, and I did not know what that meant about me. I closed the studio door and went downstairs. I made a sandwich I did not eat. I watered Helen's garden, the roses first, then the jasmine along the fence, then the lavender that she had planted the spring before the diagnosis. The hose was warm from the sun, and the water came out in a low, steady arc that darkened the soil in expanding circles. I thought about how Helen had knelt here every morning, her knees on the rubber pad, her fingers working the roots loose. She had loved this garden the way she loved the house, not as property, but as continuation, as proof that something could grow in the same place for a long time and still be alive. I texted Grace at noon. Just a short message. "Thank you again for the painting. It really is beautiful." She replied with a heart and a photograph of her own lunch, a salad with avocado and microgreens. I studied the photograph longer than I should have. The table behind her plate was clean. The light was from the left. She looked like her mother. That evening, I cooked a proper dinner for the first time since Helen died. Chicken thighs, rice, green beans from the garden. I ate at the kitchen table with the window open and the marsh smell coming in, cool and briny. The food tasted like something. I could not tell you what exactly, but it tasted like something, and that was enough. I slept near the bathroom that night. Not in it, near it. The painting was still on the tile face down, and the beads were still there, small and certain in the dark. I did not touch them. I did not need to. I had what I needed now, the candle test, Margaret's words, and a document dated 6 months before my daughter's generous gift. On Sunday morning, I walked the property perimeter, touching the fence posts, looking at the water. The tide was low, and the pluff mud gleamed in long, dark ribbons that ran toward the channel. A heron stood motionless at the waterline. I thought about Helen. I thought about the lavender she planted. I thought about the document in the portfolio, and the 4 phases, and the careful handwriting that I had taught her when she was 9 years old, guiding her fingers around the loops and bridges of cursive on a yellow legal pad at this same kitchen table. I knew what I was going to do on Monday. I was going to drive to Charleston and hand everything I had to someone whose job it was to believe the unbelievable. The fence post under my hand was rough and warm. The heron did not move. The water was very still. Monday morning, I wrapped the painting in a moving blanket using Helen's gardening gloves. No direct contact with the frame. I carried it to the car, like a man carrying a body carefully at arm's length, aware of what it contained and what it meant. The gloves went into a freezer bag sealed twice and sat on the passenger seat beside me. I backed out of the driveway at 7:45, with the blanket-wrapped frame lying flat across the back seat and the windows cracked, because I could not stand the musty smell of the storage blanket mixing with the leather. I did not drive to the police. I had said I would, standing at the fence on Sunday watching the heron. But somewhere between the fence and the morning, I had changed my mind. Not about turning the evidence over, about the order. I needed a doctor first. I needed someone who could look at what I had found and tell me whether I was right to be afraid, or whether grief had finally broken something in me that could not be repaired. An engineer does not file a structural failure report on instinct. He gets a second reading. Dr. Lenore Harmon was a general practitioner on King Street who had treated Helen's migraines for 15 years and who listened without once asking if I was sure. I sat in the chair across from her desk and described what I had seen. Silver metallic beads, machine channels beneath the varnish, a candle flame held to the back of the frame for 30 seconds. I did not say my daughter's name. I did not say who had given me the painting. I said only what I had observed, as if I were reading measurements from a bridge inspection report, and I watched her face while I spoke. She looked at me the way Helen's oncologist had looked at us 3 years ago. The same careful rearrangement of the face, the same decision not to say the worst thing first. Doctors have a language for catastrophe that sounds like calm. I had learned to read it in hospitals. I did not expect to read it in a general practitioner's office over a picture frame. "Mr. Holbrook," she said, "I am going to make a call. Stay here." She left the room. I heard her voice through the wall, low and rapid, and I stared at a framed diploma on the opposite side of the room and counted the seconds. She was gone 4 minutes. When she came back, she had an address written on her prescription pad in blue ink, and a look that told me everything her words did not. "Do not unwrap it yourself," she said. "Do not let anyone else touch it. Drive there now." The address was for a private forensic toxicology lab on a road I had driven past 100 times without noticing. I parked and carried the blanket-wrapped painting through a side entrance marked with a number but no name. The intake supervisor was a methodical man in his 40s who wore nitrile gloves before I finished my first sentence and wrote down every word as if testimony had already begun. He asked about the gloves. I told him. My wife's gardening gloves. I turned them inside out afterward. He wrote that down. He asked about the heat source. A birthday candle. He wrote that down too. He photographed the blanket, the freezer bag, the outside of the frame through the blanket, and a carbon paper receipt that he filled out in triplicate and handed to me. 3 to 4 business days, he said. We will call the number on the form. Do not discuss the submission with anyone involved in the item's origin. I drove home with nothing in the back of the car. The space where the painting had been looked like an absence with weight. Have you ever driven home from somewhere knowing your life has changed and knowing no one else on the road has any idea? Every car I passed on the bridge back to Sullivan's Island contained a person whose daughter had not tried to poison them. I envied every single one of them, and none of them knew it. I stopped at a gas station on Coleman Boulevard and bought a cup of coffee that tasted like nothing. The metallic dryness had not left my mouth since Saturday. I drank the coffee anyway, standing beside the car, watching the afternoon traffic, feeling the salt air through the open door. The receipt from the forensic facility was in my shirt pocket, rough-edged from the carbon paper. I touched it twice to make sure it was still there. At 4 o'clock, Grace called. I was pulling into the driveway when her name lit the screen. I answered the way I always answer, the way a father answers his only daughter, and I listened while she told me she kept picturing the painting over my bed. I keep picturing it over your bed, Daddy. That morning light is going to hit it perfectly. She said it the way a child talks about a drawing on the refrigerator. I told her I was still finding the right spot. The painting was in a forensic evidence locker 23 miles away. She laughed. My daughter laughed on the phone, and it was Helen's laugh. The same breath before it, the same rising note, the same way it ended in a kind of sigh. Biology is merciless. It gives your dead wife's voice to the person who is trying to take everything she left you. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a long time after she hung up. The sun was dropping behind the live oaks, and the light came through the windshield in gold bars that moved across my hands. Helen's laugh. Grace's scheme. The dissonance was something I could not hold in both hands at once. I sat there until the sun went down and the gold bars became gray, and then nothing. Then my phone buzzed. Not Grace this time. A Charleston number I did not recognize. The forensic facility. They had found something faster than expected, and they needed me to come back. The first morning, without the painting in the house, I noticed how much space the absence took up. The wall where it had leaned was just a wall again, but the bedroom felt like a room where something had been removed surgically. Clean, but not healed. I had answered the forensic facility's call the night before and confirmed I could return when results were ready. They had flagged an anomaly in the initial scan and needed to confirm the submission parameters before proceeding. No results yet. 3 to 4 days as promised. So I waited. Tuesday, I raked Helen's garden. The leaves had been accumulating since before the gallery opening, and the beds were buried under a rust-colored layer that smelled like decay and the last traces of her lavender. The rake handle was worn smooth from years of her grip, and holding it felt like holding her hand at one remove. I worked slowly, pulling the leaves into long rows, and I tried not to think about anything except the motion. I failed. At 1:47 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. Grace. A photograph of her studio, a canvas in progress, and a message, new piece coming along. How is the house feeling with the painting up? I stared at the screen for a long time before I replied. Looks wonderful, I wrote. The light catches it in the morning. 27 minutes later, at 2:14, Curtis texted, "No rush on the wall, Dad. These things need the right spot. Trust the light. I am an engineer. I know what coordinated load distribution looks like." This was two people applying pressure to the same point from different angles and pretending they were not in the same room when they planned it. Same day. Same subject. Same careful casualness. Different phones. I set mine face down on the porch railing and went back to the rake. The leaves were easier to understand. Wednesday, I drove into Charleston and ate lunch at the restaurant on East Bay, where Helen and I had gone every other Thursday for 20 years. I sat at her table, the one by the window with the cracked tile underneath that she used to press her shoe against. I ordered her shrimp and grits. The waitress did not recognize me without Helen, or maybe she did, and chose not to say anything, which would have been the kinder choice. The food tasted like grief. Not bad, not good, just weighted with a context that turned every bite into a memory of someone sitting across from me who was no longer there. I ate all of it. I sat at that table and tried to locate the exact moment my daughter decided my life was worth less than a piece of waterfront property. I could not find it. That was the worst part. There was no seam, no visible joint, where the daughter I raised became the woman who poisoned a picture frame. The transition had been seamless, and seamless things are the hardest to take apart. Thursday morning, Grace arrived unannounced. I heard the gravel crunch before I saw the car, and by the time I reached the porch, she was already walking up the steps with a paper bag from the bakery on King Street. "I brought those almond croissants from the place on King Street," she said. "You and Mom used to split one every Saturday." She said it like a gift. It landed like a test. She brought almond croissants. Helen's favorite, from the bakery where Helen and I used to sit on Saturday mornings before her hands got too shaky to hold a coffee cup. My daughter remembered that. My daughter weaponized that. The pastry was not poisoned. The pastry did not need to be. It was doing a different kind of work. We sat on the porch, and she talked about a commission she was considering, a large piece for a law firm's lobby, something abstract in blues and grays. I broke the croissant and ate it in small pieces, and the flaky exterior crumbled onto my shirt, the way it always had when Helen and I shared one. The coffee went cold because I was listening too carefully to drink. Grace's voice was bright and steady and full of the easy warmth that I had once believed was simply who she was. "Mind if I run upstairs? Long drive?" She smiled. I said, "Of course." I listened to every step she took. The stairs have a particular rhythm when someone climbs them in this house. 14 steps, and the third and 11th creak. She reached the top. Her footsteps turned left toward the bathroom. Then they stopped. Not at the bathroom door. Past it. 3 seconds of silence. Maybe 4. 3 seconds outside my bedroom door. That is how long it takes to look at a wall and see that a painting is not on it. That is how long it takes for a father to understand that his daughter came for the croissants, the way a doctor comes for a house call. The kindness is real, but it is not the reason for the visit. The toilet flushed. Water ran. She came back down the stairs with the same bright face and said nothing about the bedroom, nothing about the painting, nothing about the empty wall where a gift should have been hanging for 4 days. She kissed me on the cheek at the door. Brief, precise, placed. She picked up the bakery bag and folded it neatly and took it with her. I stood on the porch until the sound of her engine faded into the live oaks, and there was nothing left but the marsh. The autumn air smelled like salt and the last of Helen's lavender, and the porch boards were warm under my bare feet. And my daughter had just confirmed everything the forensic lab had not yet reported. She had checked. I was certain of it. And now she knew the painting was not there. But Grace did not panic. That was the thing about her plan. It had been built with enough patience that one missing painting could still be explained. Perhaps I had moved it. Perhaps I had not hung it yet. She would ask. She would wait. She had waited this long. By Friday morning she would ask about it, or worse, she would not ask at all. Either way, my window was closing. The forensic results had not arrived. Grace's clock and the lab's clock were running at the same time, and I did not know which one would reach 0 first. On the 4th day, I did not leave the house. I did not rake. I did not garden. I did not pretend. I sat in the chair Helen used to read in, the one by the window, with the faded blue cushion that still held the shape of her, and I waited for a phone call that would tell me in clinical language exactly what my daughter had built into a picture frame. The 2 clocks I had been watching all week were still running. The lab's clock, Grace's clock. I could not control either one, so I sat in my wife's chair and I let them run. At 6:18 in the evening, the phone rang. Not Grace. A woman's voice, professional and unhurried. "Mr. Holbrook, this is the forensic lab. Your results are ready. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" I said I could. She said 8:30. I wrote nothing down. I would not forget. The house was quiet after I hung up. The kind of quiet that has texture that presses against the walls. I turned on one lamp in the living room, and the circle of amber light it cast made the rest of the room seem darker by comparison. I made dinner. Chicken rice green beans. Helen's recipe, the one she had written on an index card in her careful handwriting and taped inside the cabinet door 20 years ago. I ate half of it standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt like sitting in a courtroom before the verdict. The chicken tasted like Helen's recipe, but not like Helen's cooking. Something was missing and always would be. I have waited for test results before. Soil samples, concrete cores, steel fatigue analysis. You send a piece of a bridge to a lab, and they tell you whether it will hold or fail. You do not argue with the numbers. You do not ask the numbers to be different. You read them and then you act on what they say. This was the same thing, except the bridge was my family, and the test results would tell me whether the person who built the failure into the structure was the same person who used to sit on my shoulders at 4th of July parades and point at the fireworks and say, "Daddy, that one is mine." I did not sleep. But it was not the sleeplessness of fear. It was the sleeplessness of a man standing at the edge of a bridge he built himself checking the math one last time before the load test. I sat in Helen's chair until the window went from black to gray to the pale blue of early November, and then I got up, washed my face, put on a clean shirt, and drove to Charleston. The lab looked different in the morning, smaller than I remembered. The same unmarked side entrance, but the fluorescent lights inside seemed brighter than they had on Monday, as if someone had turned them up for the occasion. The supervisor was already waiting. He led me to a small conference room with a metal table and 2 chairs, and placed a folder between us. The report was 11 pages. He walked me through it the way an engineer walks a client through a failure analysis, which I appreciated more than he knew. Mercury-based compound, he said. Custom formulation. The channels in the frame were machined, not hand-carved. This was manufactured to release vapor at sustained indoor temperatures between 68 and 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Mercury. Not arsenic. Not lead. Mercury. The element that looks like silver and moves like water and destroys the brain so slowly that the victim believes he is simply aging. My daughter had chosen a poison that would make me disappear inside my own body, and no one, not a doctor, not a neighbor, not even me, would have known the difference. The supervisor continued. The neurological profile would present as natural cognitive decline, he said. Fatigue, memory gaps, difficulty with coordination. In a man your age, he paused. He stopped himself the way a person stops at the edge of something they did not mean to say out loud. I understand, I said. It would look like getting old. He nodded. He showed me photographs. The silver beads on white tile the machine channels magnified the varnish layer, cross-sectioned under a microscope. Clinical images, beautiful in the way that engineering is always beautiful, even when the engineering is meant to kill you. Grace had not done this carelessly. She had done it with the precision I had taught her, the same precision I used on bridge joints and load calculations, and the careful alignment of steel against steel. She had learned from me. She had used what I gave her. Who gave you this painting, Mr. Holbrook? I looked at the table, at the report, at the numbers and the chemical formulas and the photographs of silver beads that I had first seen rolling across my bathroom tile in Candlelight. My daughter, I said. I said it the way you say a diagnosis out loud for the first time. Not because she needed to hear it, because I needed to say it in a room with a witness and a document and fluorescent lights where it could not be unsaid or softened or explained away. My daughter. She built this. She gave it to me. She asked me to hang it where I sleep. The supervisor asked if I wanted law enforcement involved. I told him I was already planning to. He provided a sealed copy of the report in a manila envelope and retained the original. The painting remained in their custody. I walked out into the November morning. The air was sharp and clean cooler than it had been all week, the season turning in a way I could feel on my face and in my lungs. I sat on a bench outside the building for a long time. The metal slats were cold through my trousers. I held the manila envelope on my lap and watched the traffic on the road I had driven past 1,000 times without ever stopping. Then I stood up and drove to the Charleston Police Department. I had never walked into a police station before in my life. I was about to walk into one and say my daughter's name. Detective Boyd Ramsey was younger than I expected for someone tasked with untangling the knots of major crimes. He was perhaps 32, at most 35, possessing a lean, hungry look that was softened only by a surprising stillness. There were no photographs on his desk, no smiling wife, no golden retriever, no evidence of a life outside the sterile beige walls of the precinct. He listened in a way that reminded me of the foremen I used to work with on bridge projects, men who didn't ask you to repeat yourself because they caught the frequency of the problem the first time. It was hummed. I had walked into that office with a manila envelope clutched in my hand, and a sentence I had practiced for 23 miles. I believe my daughter is trying to poison me. He didn't flinch. He didn't lean back with a skeptical sigh or raise an eyebrow at the absurdity of an old man accusing his artist daughter of attempted parricide. Instead, he simply reached out, took the envelope, and spread the forensic report across his desk. He read the first 2 pages in a silence so thick I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharp, scanning my face as if looking for the stress points in a beam. "Tell me about the painting, Mr. Holbrook," no, he said. So I told him. I laid it out exactly the way I would present a failure analysis on a bridge inspection. I started with the gallery opening the humidity of the Charleston evening, the smell of wine and expensive perfume, and the strange woman in the green beret who had gripped my wrist like a lifeline. I told him about the birthday candle I had held to the back of the frame at 2 in the morning, the way the light had flickered against the wood, and the silver beads of mercury that had rolled out like tears from a machined wound. I detailed the property document I'd found in Grace's old portfolio, a blueprint for my own erasure dated months before she'd ever handed me that gift. I spoke about the texts, those perfectly synchronized messages from Grace and Curtis, both urging me toward the bedroom, both using that same casual, practiced tone. I told him about Thursday night standing in the dark, counting the 3 seconds my daughter's footsteps had paused outside my bedroom door as she checked to see if her trap was set. Ramsey's pen moved in a rhythm that never broke. He didn't interrupt. He allowed the narrative of my betrayal to fill the room until it felt like the walls themselves were leaning in. "Let me tell you what it is like to sit in a precinct office and describe your daughter's handwriting as if it were a murder weapon. It is like reading a eulogy for a person who hasn't died yet. You are burying a version of your child that you now realize was a ghost, a construct of your own hope. The Grace I thought I knew was a girl who loved the marsh and the light. The Grace I was describing to Ramsey was a woman who calculated the value of my life by the square foot of waterfront property." Ramsey stopped writing only once. It was when I reached the part about the coordinated texts. "Both of them told you to hang it in the bedroom," he said, more to himself than to me. "Separately, but within the same hour, using nearly identical phrasing." I nodded. The movement felt like a heavy stone shifting in my chest. He wrote something down, underlined it twice, and then looked at me. His expression was no longer just professional. It was the look of a man who had seen this specific rot in different houses under different names for different amounts of money. That is not a coincidence, Mr. Holbrook," he said quietly. "That is a script." He began to probe the logistics. He asked about Curtis's career, his movements, his connections. I explained that Curtis coordinated supply chains for international firms. He had access to manufacturers, to machine shops, to the kind of precision engineering required to cut hidden channels into a walnut frame. Ramsey noted the detail about the machined nature of the channels. It suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a project. "We are filing a warrant for the King Street art supply shop this afternoon," Ramsey said, closing his notebook with a final echoing thud. "The varnish formulation in your forensic report is a red flag. It's a specialty item. Someone ordered it. Someone paid for it. And in a town like Charleston, someone definitely left a name." Then he looked at me and his voice softened. He gave me the hardest instruction I have ever received in 68 years. "Go home, Frank," he said. "Water your garden. Answer your daughter's calls. Do not change a single detail of your routine. The moment they sense the load has shifted, the moment they think you know the evidence starts to vanish. We need them to believe the plan is still on track. Go home and act normal." It was a simple sentence that felt like an impossible weight. How do you act normal when you know your home is no longer a sanctuary, but a delivery system for your own end? I drove back to Sullivan's Island, the marsh grass blurred by the speed of my car. And I tried to remember how a man who isn't being poisoned by his daughter spends his afternoon. Before I tell you how I survived the next week, comment your honest guess whose name do you think was on that King Street order and why I read every single theory. But a quick word of caution. The next part of this account contains certain dramatized elements designed for narrative depth. If that style of storytelling isn't for you, I understand if you choose to stop the video right here. For those staying, let's go deeper into the darkest part of this journey. I spent the next 7 days living in a state of hyper-awareness that felt like a low-grade fever. I watered Helen's lavender even though the November frost was already claiming the stems. I touched the graying wood of the plants and felt the emptiness of the garden. On Tuesday evening, Grace called. Her voice on the line was bright melodic, the voice of a daughter who cares. She asked if I was sleeping better. Her voice carried the same careful warmth it always had. I had once believed that warmth was effortless. I now knew it was engineered. "I think the painting is helping, Grace," I said. My own voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, a stranger I was watching from across the room. She laughed. It was a soft, tinkling sound. I recognized the pitch of it. It was the same laugh she'd had as a child, and I felt a coldness in my marrow that no heater could touch. I stood in the kitchen with my hand flat on the counter until the sound of her laughter stopped my breathing, shallow, my heart a frantic bird in a cage of ribs. Wednesday passed in a haze of salt air and silence. Thursday was worse. I cooked a meal for 1 shrimp and grits the way Helen used to make them, but the grits felt like sand in my mouth. I ate, standing up, my eyes fixed on the empty wall where the painting should have been. I read a history of the Charleston Harbor, but the words were just ink on paper. I couldn't hold a single sentence in my head. I was a man waiting for a bridge to collapse, counting the seconds between the groans of the steel. Then Thursday afternoon, a text from Curtis. Thinking about Thanksgiving at the Island House this year. Grace wants to cook Helen's recipes. Thoughts. The audacity of it was a physical blow. They wanted to sit at my table in my house and cook the food of my dead wife while they watched me slowly fade away. They wanted to carve a turkey across from a man they were turning into a ghost. I felt a surge of rage so hot it made my vision blur, but I forced my fingers to be still. I typed back, "Sounds wonderful. Let me know what to buy." Every letter I pressed felt like a betrayal of the truth, but I was an engineer, and I knew that sometimes you have to maintain the appearance of a solid structure until the demolition crew arrives. I lived inside that bad weather for a week, moving through the motions of a life that had been hollowed out. I watched the tide come in and go out, the water the color of lead, and I waited for the phone call from Ramsey that would tell me the inspection was over. On the 8th day it came. "Mr. Holbrook," Ramsey said. His voice was the same flat, professional calm, but there was a new edge to it, the sound of a hammer hitting a nail perfectly. "We executed the warrant on the King Street shop. We found the order, the payment record, and the signature. The name on it is not your son-in-law's." Ramsey didn't ask me to come to the precinct. Instead, he met me at a small, anonymous county interview room in a building that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. There were no windows. The light was a harsh, fluorescent hum that made everything look sickly and tired. He didn't shake my hand this time. He just pointed to a chair and turned a laptop screen toward me. "I need you to watch this, Frank," he said. "And I need you to remember that what you see is evidence. It isn't a memory. It's data." The footage was grainy, the frame rate stuttering in that way that makes reality look like a fever dream. It was a camera angled down at a shop counter, the King Street art supply store. I could see the bins of brushes, the tubes of oil paint, and a bell on the door that caught a glint of the afternoon sun. The timestamp in the corner read, August 29th, 6 weeks before the gallery opening. 6 weeks before my daughter walked into my home with a gift wrapped in brown paper. A figure entered the frame. It wasn't Curtis. It was a woman. She was wearing a blue puffer jacket, the one I had bought for her on her 30th birthday, because she had complained that her studio was too drafty in the winter. In the video, Grace walked up to the counter with a purposeful stride. She didn't look like an artist lost in her thoughts. She looked like an engineer. She placed a stack of cash on the counter and then slid a piece of paper, a handwritten specification sheet, across to the clerk. Ramsey paused the video. "That sheet," he said, his voice echoing in the small room. "We recovered it. It matches the formulation in your forensic report exactly. The mercury concentrations, the specific resin for the varnish, the drying times. She didn't just buy the materials, Frank. She brought the recipe. I watched my daughter on that screen. I watched her muffle the sound of the bell as she left her blue jacket, disappearing into the bright Charleston street. I didn't look away. I had spent 40 years looking at failure, at rusted bolts, at hairline cracks, at crumbling concrete. I knew that you cannot fix a structure if you refuse to see where it broke. But this wasn't steel. This was my blood. Ramsey hit play. Grace took a small, heavy bag from the clerk, tucked it into her leather purse, and walked out. 23 seconds. It took 23 seconds of security footage to dismantle 36 years of fatherhood. Your son-in-law's name isn't on any of the financial transactions, Ramsey said, his voice pulling me back from the screen. There's no record of him communicating with the shop. No digital trail. He framed the paintings, yes. He used his professional accounts to buy the wood. But the heart of the machine, the poison, and the chemistry, that was all Grace. I sat in that chair and felt the temperature of the room drop. I stared at the frozen frame of the blue jacket. My daughter's back was turned to the camera as she walked away, a bag of poison in her hand. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. That afternoon, Ramsey took me to a converted house in Wagoner Terrace. It was a beautiful old building, the kind with wide porches and tall windows, but it was surrounded now by unmarked sedans and men in windbreakers with police stenciled on the back. This was Grace's studio. You don't have to go in, Frank, Ramsey told me as he cut the engine. We have the warrant. We'll handle the inventory. Yes, I do, I said. I needed to see the place where the light was captured. I needed to see if the talent I had been so proud of, the Holbrook hands, had left a mark on the crime. When the door to the studio opened, the smell hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Linseed oil, turpentine, Damar varnish. It was the same smell that had permeated my house for decades. The smell of Grace's childhood, of the sketches she'd made at the kitchen table, while Helen watched with a proud, quiet smile. But here in this room, the smell felt different. It felt like a shroud. The studio was a cathedral of color. Her paintings were everywhere, canvases leaning against the exposed brick hung from track lighting stacked in racks. There were marshscapes that looked so real I could almost hear the cicadas. There were live oaks with moss that looked like lace. They were beautiful. They were luminous. And as I walked through the room, I realized that every single one of them was a lie. I watched the evidence technicians move with clinical precision. They didn't see the art. They saw the surface. They were looking for the how, while I was drowning in the why. In the back corner of the room stood a heavy steel filing cabinet. It was out of place among the easels and the pallets. One of the technicians bypassed the lock in a matter of seconds. Inside, tucked behind folders of tax returns and gallery contracts, was the heart of the matter. They pulled out a sealed plastic container filled with a heavy silver liquid. Mercury. Beside it was a respirator still in its box and a notebook. I recognized Grace's handwriting immediately, the elegant, tilted cursive she'd used to write me birthday cards. The notebook was filled with formulas. It was a diary of dosages. She had calculated the evaporation rate of mercury at 72 degrees, the exact temperature I kept the house in the winter. She had mapped out the timeline of my decline. And then, at the very bottom of the drawer, they found the manila folder. Inside was a quitclaim deed for the Sullivan's Island house. It was a masterpiece of premeditation. Every line was filled out in her perfect script. The legal description of the lot, the parcel number, the transfer terms. The only thing missing was my signature on the bottom line. Below it, she had already typed the names of 2 witnesses, friends of hers from the gallery, people I'd never met. I stood there surrounded by the beauty she had created, and I finally understood the architecture of her plan. It was a two-stage failure. Stage one was the painting. It was a slow-motion demolition. The mercury vapor would enter my lungs every night while I slept a silent, invisible tide. It wouldn't kill me, not at first. It would just fray the edges of my mind. It would make me forget where I put my keys. It would make me stumble. It would make me confused. It would turn the bridge engineer into a confused old man. And in that confusion, Grace would arrive. She would be the loving daughter. She would be the one to hold my hand and tell me everything was going to be okay. She would bring me the paperwork just to simplify things, Dad. She would guide my hand as I signed that deed, and I would do it because I trusted her more than I trusted my own failing memory. Stage two was the aftermath. Once the property was hers, I would be moved to a facility. For your own safety, Dad. The house would be sold to the highest bidder, one of those developers Curtis had been talking about. The history of the Holbrooks would be leveled by a bulldozer to make room for a glass box on the dunes. I turned away from the cabinet and looked at the far wall. There was a canvas there unfinished. It was just a pencil sketch on gesso. It was my house. Our house. She had drawn the porch rail with the same knife marks Helen's grandfather had made. She had drawn the live oak. She had drawn the marsh. It was a portrait of the thing she was willing to kill for. Ramsey's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway, his voice a low murmur against the sound of the technicians bagging evidence. When he came back, his face was set in a grim, hard line. "We have her location," he said. "She's at a gallery dinner in Mount Pleasant. We're picking her up tonight." The detective told me one last thing as we stood in the fading light outside the studio. He said it with a flat, factual tone, as if he were reporting the weather, but it was the detail that finally broke my heart. Grace had filed for divorce from Curtis back in September. It was a secret filing handled by a firm in Columbia to keep it off the local radar. Curtis didn't know. He was still playing the part of the supportive husband, still framing her paintings, still planning Thanksgiving dinner, completely unaware that he had already been edited out of her life. She was going to take the house, sell the land, and disappear. She had reduced every relationship in her life to a line item. Curtis, the logistics. Me, the equity. Even Helen's death had been absorbed into the timeline without sentiment. I drove home to the island and sat in my car in the gravel driveway for a long time. The house looked so peaceful in the twilight. The salt air was cool, carrying the scent of the coming winter. I sat there and realized that for 36 years, I had been building a bridge to a daughter who didn't exist. I had invested every ounce of my love into a structure that had no foundation. That evening the phone rang. It was Grace. I knew with a certainty that made my hands shake that this was the last time I would ever hear her voice outside of a courtroom. That knowledge sat between us on the line like a third person, invisible and cold. She talked about the painting again. She was obsessed with its placement. She asked if I had moved it to the bedroom yet. She told me she had been thinking about the morning light on the marsh and how she wanted to capture that same silver quality in her next series. Her voice was warm, solicitous, the voice of a daughter who was worried about her father's health. "The bedroom gets the best light, Dad," she said. "I really think that's the spot where you'll appreciate the work the most." "Maybe you're right, Grace," I said. It was the last lie I would ever have to tell her. "I'll think about it." "Good. You sound tired, Dad. You should get some rest." "I love you." "I love you too," I said. And I meant it. That was the part that no one, not Ramsey, not the lawyers, not the people who will eventually read the news reports, will ever be able to understand. I loved the daughter I thought I had. I loved the memory of the girl who used to sit on the dock with me and name the constellations. I loved the person she was supposed to be. Both things were true at once, the love and the betrayal, the memory and the mercury. I hung up the phone and walked out onto the back porch. The wind was moving through the marsh grass, a low, sibilant sound. I looked at the dark water and tried to understand how a human being can hold two opposite intentions in a single breath. My daughter was telling me she loved me while she waited for the poison to take hold. She was planning a life without me while she asked about my dinner. I stood there until the cold became a physical pain in my chest. Tomorrow she would be in handcuffs. Tonight, she was still my daughter. I went inside, locked the door, and sat in Helen's chair in the dark. I didn't sleep. I just listened to the house. The next morning, I made breakfast with a mechanical precision. I scrambled an egg in the same cast-iron pan Helen had used for 40 years. I made toast. I made coffee. I did these things because if I stopped moving, I knew I would fall apart. I ate at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over the marsh. The table felt impossibly large. The silence was a physical weight. At 7:30, I walked the perimeter of the property. I counted the fence posts. I checked the latch on the gate. I was an engineer, and I was checking the integrity of the only thing I had left. The salt air was sharp, the tide coming in with a slow, relentless push. At 8:40, the phone rang. It was Martha, my neighbor. She had known Helen for decades. She was the kind of island neighbor who noticed when a different car pulled into a driveway. "Stank, there are cars at Grace's house," she whispered. "Unmarked sedans. And men in jackets. Is everything okay?" "Thank you, Martha," I said. "I'm aware." There was a long pause on the line. She didn't ask how I was aware. She just said, "Call me if you need a place to sit, Frank." I hung up and stood in the kitchen. I looked at the clock on the wall. I tried to imagine the sound of the handcuffs clicking shut on Grace's wrists. I tried to imagine the expression on her face. Would she be angry? Would she be cold? Or would she simply look at the police as if they were another logistical hurdle to be solved? Let me tell you what the arrest of your only child sounds like from 23 miles away. It sounds like the wind in the cordgrass. It sounds like the tide hitting the pilings of the dock. It sounds like the absolute crushing weight of a silence that will never be filled again. Ramsey called at noon. "She's in custody, Frank." There was no incident. She was remarkably calm. "And Curtis?" I asked. He was there. He'd just come back from a night shift. He didn't know Frank. He's in shock. He's cooperating, but I think the man's world just ended. Ramsey's voice on the phone had been flat, and certain the voice of a man who had seen enough to stop being surprised. I hung up and stood at the window. The tide was at its peak. The marsh was flooded. The cordgrass submerged. The land turned briefly into something that looked like open water. I had been the last person in my own life to see what was already visible to everyone else. That was the part I would have to live with. I went inside and waited. I opened the door, and the world seemed to tilt. Dorothy Callahan stood on my porch, her frame small, but as unyielding as a reinforced pylon. She held a sealed envelope in both hands, clutching it against her chest, like a sacred relic, or a piece of evidence that had finally found its rightful owner. She was 73 years old, a retired art conservator who had spent 30 years restoring the fading glory of oil paintings for private collections and prestigious museums across the Lowcountry. She was the woman from the gallery, the one who had gripped my wrist with the strength of a drowning person. But she was more than a stranger with a warning. As I looked at her, really looked at her, I saw a ghost of a memory I couldn't quite place. She was the silent partner in a life I thought I knew. She had been Helen's closest friend for 3 decades, a bond forged in the chemistry of pigments and the shared silence of restoration labs. And yet in all those years I had never once heard her name until Margaret whispered it to me over the phone 5 weeks ago. She did not offer a greeting. There was no hello, no how are you, no polite preamble to soften the blow. She simply looked me in the eye and said, "Helen asked me to come when the structure finally gave way. It has given way, Frank." I stepped aside, my limbs feeling heavy and disconnected, and let her in. She walked through the hallway with a familiarity that chilled me. She didn't look around at the photos or the furniture. She moved straight into the kitchen and sat down at the wooden table as if she had occupied that seat 1,000 times before. And in that moment, the realization hit me like a physical weight. She had been here, many times, while I was away inspecting bridges in the upstate, while I was measuring steel on the Cooper River, while I was building the infrastructure of a public life. My wife had been sitting at this very table with this woman, building a private fortress I was never meant to see. Dorothy began to speak, and her voice was the sound of a long-held secret finally being set down. She told me about the summer 2 years before the gallery opening. She had been at the King Street art supply shop, her usual haunt, when she spotted a custom order for a specific varnish formulation. To an amateur, it was just a chemical list. To a conservator of 30 years, it was a red flag. It was a mercury-based compound, a toxic recipe that hadn't been used in legitimate art for a century. I traced the specification form. Dorothy said, her eyes fixed on the grain of the table. I saw Curtis's name on the order. He handled the logistics, the framing, the shipping. He provided the professional cover. But when I went back to the shop and asked the clerk about the pickup, the description didn't match Curtis. It was a woman. A woman in a blue puffer jacket. It was Grace. She had taken that information to Helen. At the time, Helen was already fighting the cancer, her body a failing bridge of bone and spirit. Helen knew about Grace long before the rest of us, Dorothy whispered, and the pain in her voice was palpable. Shvidu. She told me the coldness in Grace was like a hairline fracture in a support beam, hard to see at first, but deep enough to bring down the whole house. Helen had chosen Curtis for Grace, hoping his steady, simple nature would stabilize her. When she realized that wasn't enough, she chose me for you. She knew you wouldn't be able to see the monster in your own daughter, Frank. You love too purely for that. I thought of a photograph I had seen in Dorothy's own home later on, a black and white shot, slightly overexposed. It showed Helen at 25, laughing at something just out of frame. I had never seen that photo in our house. My wife had a best friend for 30 years, a secret history, and a laugh I never saw captured from that specific angle. All of it had been hidden to keep a perimeter around my heart. Helen had loved me in ways that required her to live a double life, protecting me from the reality of our own child. Dorothy explained the night of the gallery. She had gone twice. The first night, Grace was watching me too closely, like a hawk over a field. The second night, Dorothy saw her window. She had 45 seconds to reach me, deliver the warning about the candle in the frame, and disappear back into the shadows before Grace could see her. She protected you for 40 years, Frank, Dorothy said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Her fingers were still strong, the fingers of a woman who spent her life meticulously piecing together what was broken. She didn't protect you from the world. She protected you from the person you loved most. And when she knew she was dying, she made me swear a blood oath that I would step in if the worst happened. She paused the silence in the kitchen, stretching until it felt like it would snap. Like the worst happened, Frank? She gave you that painting with a smile, knowing it would slowly erase your mind so she could take this land. She turned her art into a weapon. Dorothy reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out a thick envelope. Helen's handwriting was on the front, that elegant, slightly tilted script she used for things of permanence. Just my name, Frank. She wrote this during her final week, Dorothy said. She told me to give it to you only if Grace finally made her move. I've been watching the King Street records for 2 years, waiting. When I saw the delivery to this house, I knew. I took the envelope. It felt impossibly light, yet I knew it contained the full mass of my wife's final thoughts. I wasn't ready to open it. I set it on the counter next to the coffee maker and stared at it for 3 days, unable to break the seal. The weeks that followed were a blur of institutional gray. I sat in the Charleston County Courthouse for Grace's preliminary hearing, a building that smelled of floor wax and old paper, a place where human tragedy is reduced to docket numbers. Grace sat at the defense table, her auburn hair pulled back tight, wearing a charcoal suit I had never seen. She looked professional. She looked successful. She didn't look like a woman who had tried to vaporize her father's brain with mercury. She never looked at me. Not once. I sat 3 rows behind her, staring at the back of her head, trying to find the little girl who used to ask me how the tides worked. I couldn't find her. The shape of her head was the same. The slope of her shoulders was the same, but the architecture of her soul was something alien to me now. In the corridor after the hearing, I ran into Curtis. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His skin was sallow, his eyes bloodshot. He walked over to me, his hands trembling. "I didn't know, Frank," he rasped, his voice breaking. "I handled the frames, yes. I ordered the wood. She told me it was a special preservation technique for her high-end clients. I never questioned her. I thought I was helping her career. I swear to God, I didn't know I was building a coffin for you." I looked at him and saw the same reflection I saw in the mirror every morning, a man who had been used as a tool by someone he loved. I told him I believed him. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement, and walked away into the crowd. He was just another piece of logistics Grace had discarded once the project failed. As I turned to leave, the officers were moving Grace through the side exit. They had to pass the hallway where I stood. For the first time, our eyes met. Her face was a mask of absolute calm. There was no shame, no anger, no "I'm sorry." "If you had just hung it in the bedroom like I asked, Dad," she said, her voice cool and melodic, "it would have been over by Christmas. You wouldn't have felt a thing. You would have just gone to sleep and stayed there." The officers pulled her away, but her words hung in the air like the metallic scent of the mercury itself. She wasn't apologizing. She was critiquing the failure of her own design. She was proud of the engineering. I drove back to Sullivan's Island with the windows down, the salt air stinging my eyes. I walked into the house, picked up the envelope from the counter, and finally sat down at the kitchen table to read the words my wife had left for me from across the border of life and death. Helen's letter was 2 pages long, written on the heavy cream-colored stationery she kept for matters of record. As I unfolded the sheets, I could almost smell the faint trace of the beeswax and turpentine that had defined her life. Her handwriting was steady, each loop and curve executed with the precision of a master conservator. But before I could read a single word, a photograph slid out of the folds and landed face down on the table. I picked it up, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. It was Helen in a blue dress, maybe 22 or 23 years old. She was standing outside the Art Institute of Chicago, her arm linked with Dorothy's. They were both laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that reached their eyes. It was a version of Helen I had only caught in glimpses, a version that existed before the weight of marriage, motherhood, and the hidden burden of our daughter's nature had settled onto her shoulders. She looked luminous. She looked free. I realized then that Helen had given this photo to Dorothy to keep, not because she wanted to hide it from me, but because she knew I would need to see her this way when the world finally fell apart. She wanted me to remember that before she was a protector, she was a woman who knew how to laugh. I set the photo down and began to read. The letter was divided into 3 distinct movements, like the sections of a bridge. The first movement was about Grace. "Frank, if you are reading this, it means the fracture has finally become a break. You were never wrong to love her. I need you to know that first. The love you gave her was real, even if the person you gave it to was unable to hold it. I saw the shadow in her a long time ago, a lack of empathy that felt like a missing bolt in a vital joint. I chose not to tell you the full extent of it because I couldn't bear to be the one to break your heart. I thought I could manage it. I thought if I built enough scaffolding around her, I could keep the structure from collapsing. I was wrong. I am sorry I left you to face the debris alone." The second movement was about the house and the land. "This property is more than real estate, Frank. It is the record of our lives. Every board in the porch carries the sound of our footsteps. Every window holds the light of the mornings we spent together. Grace sees it as an asset to be liquidated. I need you to see it as a sanctuary to be defended. Do not let her take it. Do not let her turn our history into a bank account. Stay in the house, Frank. Let the walls remind you that you are still standing. The third movement was about the garden, specifically the lavender. The lavender will look dead by the time this letter reaches you. It always does in the winter. You'll be tempted to pull it up to think the roots have failed. Don't. Lavender is resilient, but it requires a hard pruning. You have to cut away the woody dead parts to let the new growth have a chance in the spring. It's painful to look at, I know. It looks like you're destroying the plant, but you're actually saving its life. You are in your winter now, Frank. Cut back the dead weight. Let the roots rest. The spring will come, even if you can't see it yet. I sat at the table until the December light faded into a bruised purple over the marsh. The only light in the kitchen was the single yellow bar from the street lamp cutting across the paper and the photograph of the two laughing women in Chicago. Helen wasn't just talking about the plants. She was giving me a manual for survival. She was telling me that Grace was the woody dead part that had to be cut away so that I could continue to live. She was telling me that my dormancy wasn't death, it was preparation. I read the letter 3 more times, memorizing the cadence of her voice in the ink. Then I did something I hadn't done since the funeral. I went to the drawer beside the stove where Helen kept her recipe cards. The handwritten instructions for shrimp and grits, for tomato pie, for the almond croissants she loved. I tucked the letter and the photograph into the very back of the drawer. Her final words would live next to her favorite flavors. It felt like a proper burial. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the oppressive, hollow quiet of the previous weeks. It was a settled quiet. The clock on the wall measured the seconds with a rhythmic, mechanical certainty. The refrigerator hummed its low, domestic song. Outside, the iron gate creaked in a sudden gust of wind, the same creak I had heard since 1962. These were the sounds of a structure that had been tested and had held. I was 68 years old, and I was the last inspector of the Holbrook estate. Finally, I stood up and went upstairs. I didn't go to my bedroom. Instead, I went to the small hall closet at the end of the corridor, the one where we kept the archives, the cardboard tubes of blueprints, and the manila folders of Grace's early work that Helen couldn't bear to throw away. I dug through the tubes until I found the one marked Grace, age 12. Inside was a crayon drawing on cheap manila paper, the edges curled and yellowed with age. It was a drawing of our house. It was primitive, the perspective all wrong, the colors too bright, but the details were there. The porch was there. The live oak was there. The iron gate was there. And at the bottom, in the careful labored block letters of a 12-year-old girl, it said, "For Dad." This was the truest thing Grace had ever made. Before the greed, before the methodology, before she decided that a house was worth more than a father. This was the version of my daughter I chose to keep. I carried the drawing into my bedroom. The nail was still in the wall, the one Curtis had hammered in for the last painting, the one meant to hold the Mercury. I took the crayon drawing and hung it there. It was small and slightly crooked, a fragile piece of paper on a vast, empty wall. I lay down in my bed and looked at it. The next morning, the sun rose over the marsh, exactly where it always did. The light came through the window, hitting the crayon drawing and making the wax colors glow. Helen was right. She was right about the light, and she was right about the lavender, and she was right about Dorothy. But most of all, she was right about me. I got out of bed and walked down to the kitchen. I made a pot of coffee and stood at the window watching the tide come in. The water was silver and cold, pushing against the cordgrass, reclaiming the land inch by inch. I thought about the bridge I had spent my life inspecting. I thought about the cracks I had found, and the ones I had missed. I went out to the garden with my pruning shears. The lavender was gray and brittle, looking for all the world like a collection of dead sticks. I knelt in the dirt, the same dirt Helen had worked for 40 years, and I began to cut. I cut away the dead wood. I cut back the overgrowth. I stripped the plant down to its core, leaving nothing but the sturdy, silent roots hidden beneath the soil. My hands were steady. The air was cold. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't waiting for the structure to fail. I was the one making sure it stood. The house was quiet. The gate was closed. And the roots were still there. That was more than enough. I walked back inside, poured a second cup of coffee, and sat at the table where my wife had sat with her friend. I looked at the empty chair across from me and didn't feel the hollow ache of loss. I felt the presence of a woman who had loved me enough to build a bridge back to the living. I picked up a pen and a pad of paper. I had a few things of my own to record. After all, a structure is only as good as its last inspection, and I wasn't finished yet. I spent 40 years inspecting the steel bones of bridges, ensuring every joint could hold the weight of 1,000 lives. But I failed to see the rot in the family story I built at home. I trusted love, blindly believing that a father's devotion was a shield no shadow could pierce. Don't be like me. Don't assume that history and blood are enough to secure a foundation. Love is a choice we make every day, but vigilance is the price we pay to keep that love safe. Looking back, this family story has taught me that the people we raise can become strangers in the light of their own ambitions. I realized that my daughter didn't just want the house. She wanted to erase the man who stood in the way of her finish line. My perspective on life has shifted. I no longer look for the strength in the steel, but for the honesty in the eyes of those across the table. I believe God allowed this trial to happen, not to break me, but to open my eyes before the bridge finally collapsed. While the law handles the dad revenge that I never sought, I find peace in the truth. This wasn't about a dad revenge fueled by hate, but a father's need for justice. I chose to stand my ground, because some things like the legacy Helen left behind are worth fighting for. In this messy family story, I've learned that the most important structure you will ever maintain is your own clarity of mind. Even if the dad revenge feels heavy, the weight of the truth is always lighter than a lie. Thank you for walking with me to the very end of this difficult journey. I'd truly value your thoughts. What would you have done if you found yourself in my shoes, facing a betrayal from someone you raised? I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective in the comments below. If this account resonated with you, please consider subscribing so you don't miss our upcoming narratives. A gentle reminder: while this was inspired by real-world social themes and deep human experiences, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this particular style or subject isn't quite what you're looking for, please feel free to explore other videos on the channel that might suit your taste better. Stay safe and keep your eyes open.